Today's video is sponsored by Mobalytics and their pregame function. Pregame is a really neat feature that gives you all sorts of stats and information on the upcoming match when you're loading into game. Recently, this function has been updated to give faster info, making it cleaner to use and easier to scroll. It also has new features like a power spike feature for each team and showing damage type bars. It's really neat and actually super useful. You can check it out and use it yourself for free with the link in the description below. This is the last Aatrox game I ever played before he was so cruelly removed from the game and replaced with this monstrosity. This was a solo queue game I played where I ended up going 7-0-9, an absolutely perfect game where it was actually one of the most enjoyable games I had for a very long time. I thought it was a pretty good way to send off Aatrox before he was torn away from my hands. Playing through this game really reminded me of how far Aatrox had come. He was a champion that went through a very strange development cycle and release cycle to the public where he was put out, and for those of you who don't know, he was kind of good right away and he had a few changes and nerfs to him, but after a few patches, Riot just stopped doing anything to him. There was a full 2-year stretch from Season 5 to Season 7 where Riot didn't do anything to try and fix Aatrox. He became the butt end of a joke in the community that he was just the worst champion in all of League of Legends, and sadly, he didn't really have any room to shine or ever be anything that was good for a really long time. He was just a troll pick for a full 2 years. But finally, after this 2-year stretch, on patch 7.5, Riot gave a big update to Aatrox and finally reworked him. He got this big rework where suddenly he wasn't so bad anymore. This rework gave him a number of new abilities, it removed a number of old abilities, and really changed his kit into something that was actually pretty good. It took a few more patches of Riot balancing him out and tweaking things here and there, but eventually Aatrox went from the worst champion in the game to someone that was actually pretty playable. He was no longer a stat check champion, he was no longer one of those champions that was either overpowered or complete garbage and never having any room in between. He was actually someone that was very playable and very skill oriented. Eventually, patch after patch, the community got a little bit better with him and he slowly became a fairly meta pick. He started to become a real champion. I mean, he was just like any other top laner in the game. He was pretty skillful if you were skillful with him, but he still had plenty of weaknesses to exploit if either you didn't know how to play against him or if maybe your opponent did. And this all culminated in the last couple of patches when Riot ended up giving a bunch of changes to Rageblade that made it very good on certain champions. Aatrox was one of those champions, and he abused the item a fair amount to a point where he became arguably the best top laner in the game. And then one patch later, Riot reworked him, and then suddenly he became the worst champion in the game again. This is one of the most tragic things I've ever seen in League of Legends. The champion who was the worst champion in the game for such a long period of time, who people had been begging for a rework for 2 full years, he finally got his rework. He finally became a meta champion. He finally became a solid top lane pick that was skillful if you were skillful with him, but still had plenty of weaknesses and counterplay if you knew how to play against him. But then Riot gave him a second rework that just made him the worst champion out there again. I will say it is still relatively early to just say this Aatrox rework is dead on arrival. I mean, there is a good chance that this rework is stillborn, but there's also a good chance that it might come back and become something that's not that bad. But whether this rework ends up being good or not, I still have to contend that this is the worst rework that Riot has ever done, and it doesn't even have anything to do with how bad he is right now. I know a lot of people think that Aatrox still needed a second rework after he ended up getting his first one, which I may disagree with, but even if that's something you believe, this is still a kit that does not fit well with Aatrox, and it doesn't keep any of what the old Aatrox was, which is really one of the biggest things that determines whether a rework is successful or not. I have a little rule that I kind of try and use to determine whether or not a rework is thematically something that works with a specific champion, and the rule basically goes as follows. If you were to give all of the abilities of a champion's rework to a player without telling them what champion that rework belongs to, the player should be able to figure it out themselves just through hearing what the abilities are. So let me give you an example. If I were to tell you that there's a champion that has a Q that's a dash that resets on kills, a W that mitigates a little damage while spitting a little damage out, an E that's an AoE skill shot stun, and an R that's a big damage dealing ultimate for team fights that you can use to reset your Q again, you should be able to know that, oh, that's very clearly Aurelia. A dash that resets on kills with the Q, that's something that's very clearly centric to Aurelia, so that must be Aurelia's rework. The reason I use this rule is because reworks are something that is completely different from releasing a new champion. If you're going to rework a champion that already exists, then you have to do something to keep some element of what the champion that exists already brings to the table. I mean, this is like when Hollywood movies go and remake old classics. If you're going to go make a movie on something that already has a source material that exists, you better stick to the original source material. You can go and create your new story if you're not even going to bother respecting the original one. The same applies to reworks. If you have a kit that doesn't have anything to do with any current champion, you can just release that as a new champion. If you're going to go and change a champion that already exists though, then you really should try and do something to keep what it is that makes players enjoy that champion right now. If you want another example, just look at something like Warwick, which a lot of people consider the best rework that Riot has ever done. If you were to tell players back in the day that there was a champion's rework that was coming out where he had a Q that he could use to close down gaps while dealing a lot of damage, a W that allowed him to see enemies and run faster towards them, an E that was some hard crowd control in the form of a fear, and an R that was a dash that suppressed opponents that it landed upon, then people would very clearly say, oh, that sounds exactly like Warwick. But let's go ahead and try this out with Aatrox and his rework here. What if I were to tell you that there was a champion that had 3 dashes on their Q that damaged and crowd controlled opponents, where they also had a W that was a little bit of hard crowd control in the form of a skill shot. They had an E that was a small dash that comboed together with your Q, and an R that was an ultimate form that gave you bonus AD as well as a revive. If I were to give you that kit, you would either think that A, Riot is reworking Riven, or B, Riot is releasing a new champion that's Riven's brother or something, Briven. A lot of people out there think that Aatrox's old kit was toxic to the game, which I disagree with myself, but even if that's something that you believe, you can still rework a champion, changing their kit significantly while still maintaining what it was that made that character in the first place. A good example is Yorick. Yorick, before his rework, was actually the worst champion ever. I mean, he was more toxic than Teemo. He was impossible to play against. He had infinite sustain. He had infinite harass potential, where he didn't even have to be near you to harass you, and he was just insanely frustrating to play against. He was actually the worst designed champion ever. Riot managed to give him a kit, though, that still revolved around summoning ghouls. It still had a big scary ghoul with his ultimate. It had a few abilities that helped him use his ghouls to damage opponents more so, with a few interesting crowd controls and a few interesting abilities that we hadn't really seen before, like his W, and he still had a very good kit that revolved around the ideas presented in the original champion. This Aatrox rework has no ideas that were presented with the original champion. And I really want to say this right here, okay? The old Aatrox was genuinely good. The old Aatrox, after his first rework at least, and after Riot already fixed him, he was actually a very skill-oriented kit. He was very fun to play. He was very fun to play against if you knew what you were doing and you weren't bronze, and he was very well balanced too. He did not need a rework. Let me go ahead and take you through his old kit and remind you what went on when you played as him and against him. For those of you who never played him yourself and only ever had to deal with a fed Aatrox late game who scarred you forever and gave you a personal bias against the champion. Firstly, he was very skill-oriented. He was not just about auto attacks. He was actually just as much about comboing burst damage abilities together in the early game as he was about auto attacking to win late game. You had to do a lot of things like combo Q, E together, then get an activated W and the burst damage from your ultimate. That combo together probably dealt as much damage as however many auto attacks you would get off in a certain trade. Combos like that, in addition to trying to combo and get your revive up and get your passive activated, was something that was very skill oriented. You would have to stack your passive properly, counting your abilities before engaging, trying to fight, trying to land all your abilities since you have 2 skill shots, and improvising if you miss a skill shot to make sure you get that GA up, especially if you're fighting outnumbered. And even the auto attacking portion of him late game was something that was still skill oriented. A lot of people think of auto attack champions like Master Yi and Tryndamere as just brainless champions where you right click and win, and And with champions like Master Yi and Tryndamere, yeah, that might be true to some extent. Master Yi has a million movement speed, and Tryndamere has a very powerful slow, so it's pretty difficult for opponents to get away from them. But Aatrox doesn't have that. Aatrox has a very weak gap closer and a very difficult to land slow that doesn't even last that long. So for Aatrox, really, you have to be good at attack click moving. Attack click moving on melee champions is incredibly important and very difficult to do when you have very high attack speed. It's important to do it on champions like Aatrox because you're going to get kited to hell if you can't successfully attack click move. Every part of this champion was skill oriented. His auto attacks were, his abilities were difficult to land. I mean, if anything, he was a very difficult champion to play while still being fairly easy to play against. I understand he got into the realm of maybe being overpowered when he was a part of that whole meta with Ginsu's Rage Blade, but if you ignore the bit with Ginsu's Rage Blade, because that was more about the item being overpowered rather than Aatrox being poorly designed, just think about how you have to beat him. All you have to do is land CC. That's pretty much it. Again, a lot of people try and compare him to Master Yi and Tryndamere and say that they are quote-unquote stat check champions, meaning that all they have to do is right-click and then they win. But with Master Yi and Tryndamere, that is true to some extent, mostly because Master Yi gets to go untargetable, making it very difficult to kill him before he kills you, and Tryndamere has his ultimate, which makes it very difficult to kill him, obviously. But with Aatrox, it's actually pretty easy to deal with him. It's easy to kite an Aatrox. If you just focus crowd control down on him, then it's pretty easy for range characters to deal with him. His revive isn't anything that special. It doesn't allow him to stay alive much longer, and if he gets caught out or crowd controlled, then he's going to die anyway. It's not like he has a reliable escape that he can use to get away after reviving. I really disagree with this notion that Aatrox was just another Tryndamere or Master Yi, because while Tryndamere and Master Yi can have problems being so focused around their auto attacks and not having too much counterplay to play against them, especially if they end up getting fed, Aatrox was not in that vein. Aatrox was actually much more like Jax than anyone else. Jax is a champion that, yes, has a lot of damage coming out with his auto attacks, but he also is just as much about using his abilities. He has very long cooldowns, especially in the early game on some of them, and using his ultimate, using his counter strike, and using his leap strike at the opportune moments, not wasting the abilities and using them at their most effective, is the only way you're going to succeed on Jax. Jax is actually someone that can do very, very poorly if you mess up those abilities and you just rely on your auto attacks. Aatrox is very similar. They're both champions that had fairly short and somewhat unreliable, at least for Aatrox, gap closers on their Q. They both had very short crowd control on their E's and ultimates that are imperative to use at the right time, while they also actually have that 3-hit combo that they can use to combo abilities together and try and get a fair amount of burst damage out. Again, just as much getting burst damage out in laning phase as getting sustained damage out late game. But I don't know, maybe you just completely disagree with me, and maybe I'm never going to be able to get it through your head how great the old Aatrox was. I feel like you never played it if that's really what you think, if you think he just had a toxic kit that was never ever going to be balanced, because he really was turning balance before Rage Blade broke him. But even if that's something you believe, why the hell is it okay for Riot to choose the Aatrox rework as an opportunity to release Riven 2.0 rather than trying to keep any semblance of Aatrox left in his kit? This is not Aatrox anymore. This is Beatrox. The only element of his old kit that seems to be kept in his new kit was his revive. He still technically has a revive, but while his old revive was something that was very skill-oriented, having to stack your passive properly and counting your abilities before fighting and improvising in the middle of a fight to get that revive passive up as soon as possible, that skillful, exciting element of his kit has been reduced to press R and get your GA. I mean, I think that just kind of shows what this Aatrox rework turned into. It seriously bothers me that Riot continues to have misguided principles when going and reworking champions, as Aurelia's rework actually looks more and more like a failure every day, which is a video for another time. I can't help but disagree with the direction they seem to be going, and I can't help but feel sorry for any champion who's next up on the chopping block.